Welcome to our webinar. I know we're talking about a topic that's probably top of mind for a lot of leaders, no matter where you're calling in from, but it is around the impending Esser funding cliff that everybody keeps talking about. Our team has been doing a lot of research on how we best advise our existing districts on how they might want to make decisions around spending what's left of their funding. And we also want to share some of our learnings that have come out of that research with you all today. So this webinar is really how do you creatively allocate those funds to meet some of your existing goals. So I am your host. My name is Gabby Hewitt. I'm actually based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I support our districts up and down the East Coast with a big focus on New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New Jersey. So if you are calling in from one of those states, I'm really excited to have you, and I hope you have some better weather than we have today. All right, just really quickly, if you haven't been on one of our webinars before, we are Education Elements. We are a K-12 education consulting firm, and all that means is we get to help districts across the country solve some of their biggest problems. Some of the challenges that we have been able to support districts with are around instruction, this idea of strategy. How do we set the vision for our district and make sure that all of our goals and decisions align to that vision? How do we develop our leaders and help you create a pipeline of talent? That way you're sort of home growing leadership to help you scale as your district grows. And then we also have a survey arm that brings us a lot of surveys, helps us with community engagement, gives us some research-backed best practices on how do we really dig into the current state of the districts and schools that we work with. Today, our focus is really going to be on this idea of strategy. And so a lot of the decisions that you're making around Esser funding sort of fall under this category of strategic decision-making and how aligned is this to my goals for the district. So excited to have you here and share more about this. All right, we're going to start with one more sort of quick check-in in the chat. If you've been on our webinars or if you work with us already, we love to start with a check-in for a couple reasons. It gives us a chance to get present in the space, and it also primes us for the discussion that we're about to have by giving everyone a chance to share. And so you'll be able to share in the chat. But we're going to call this the $500 challenge. And I know it's not nearly as much as what you receive in Esser funding, but it's just big enough for us to wrap our heads around in the length of about half of a song, so 90 seconds. So I'm going to play a song in the background, and your question or your challenge is to consider what you would do if you had $500 to spend on something that would benefit your students and your staff, or if you work with a team, something that would benefit your team overall. You also want to consider, this isn't a lot of time to make a decision and it's a finite amount of money. What's going to give you the best return on your investment? Okay, so go ahead and think about that question. It could be something that's related to team building. It could be a resource you need. What would you spend that money on? Go ahead and drop your answers in the chat. If it was hard to come up with the answer in just under 2 minutes, that's totally okay. I think that was the purpose of this exercise, but a very similar exercise was actually given to a group of Stanford business students back in 2009. Their professor, Professor Tina Seelig, actually gave them the $5 challenge. So not quite 500, but again, a finite amount of money. And they were also given a week of time to plan with each other. And their goal and their only directive was to make a plan to create some level of a return on their investment. They could be as creative as they wanted. So they had $5 to invest. They wanted to make the most money on the return from that $5. They had a week to plan their strategy. And at the end, every single group was given a 3-minute time slot in front of the entire Stanford business class to sort of share their process, what they did, and what they ended up getting as a return on their investment, what their results were. And so as you can imagine, each group sort of fell into a couple of different categories. So there were some groups that really looked at that variable of the money, right? We have $5 and they tried to flip it. This is, sort of like the house flipping model. They would buy something from a store and then turn around and sell it on the street. And then they would buy something else with their profit and turn around and sell that. So they might buy things like toys or snacks and then go onto college campuses and sell it for a profit. So those groups were pretty successful. They did receive a return on their investment, and a lot of groups sort of fell into this first category. The second group really focused on the variable of the time, right? And so they had, a few hours. They had they had a week to plan their strategy, but really 2 hours to make a return on their investment. And so they did what we would call a side hustle or the gig economy type of work to make additional income. They would go onto college campuses and they would stand by the bike racks and they would say, hey, I'll fill up your bike tires for, a couple of dollars. Or they would make really hard to score dinner reservations and fill up those blocks. And then they would turn around and go to people waiting in line and say, hey, you're waiting for a table? I'll sell you this reservation. And so those groups made even more of a return on their investment. So they didn't necessarily even use their $5. They really just focused on the time that they had and that using that as their greatest resource. There, however, was one really creative group and they were the winning group. And I'll share more about what they did. But they actually just sort of ignored the time and they ignored the dollars. They didn't even look at those two variables. And they said there's actually a hidden asset in the challenge itself, and that is this 3-minute presentation. There is a group of Stanford business students. It's a captive audience. You have 3 minutes. That's incredible ad space. And so if there are businesses in the area that are trying to recruit business students for internships or to apply for starting level jobs, they would pay to have that 3-minute time slot in front of the students themselves. And so this group was able to actually find a local business, and they were like, yeah, we would love to talk to a group of Stanford business students. They sold their presentation for $650. And if you add the $5 that they were originally given, they had almost a 13,000% return on their investment. And so the reason why I'm framing sort of our conversation today with this case study from the business school is that when we're thinking about using something really finite, like our Esser funding dollars, or we have a very set amount of time to spend it, we're trying to get all of our decisions made by September or by this fall, then we could fall into one of those first two buckets, right? We could focus on the money that we have left. We could focus on the time, but this conversation is meant to help you think a little bit more creatively. So how can we be more creative about the decisions that we're making to allocate the remainder of our Esser funding spend? And so this is the journey that we're going to take today over the next, hour or so. First is I'm going to share with you some real challenges that districts that we support have faced and how they sort of use their Esser funding dollars to create a solution for that challenge. I'm going to give you some questions that I think would be really helpful for you to take back to your teams. These are big questions that you should be considering on how you sort of fall into that third bucket. How can you creatively maximize your return on investment? And then I'm also going to give you a framework that's going to help you do these final things, like thinking through your real world situations and helping you plan for the future. And just as a follow-up, these slides, the recording, and then the framework that I'll share with you will all be sent in a follow-up email. All right, so let's get started. Here's where I'm going to ask you to go back into the chat. But this is coming from a study out of Edunomics Lab. They do a lot of research around economics and education, right? How are districts receiving funding? What are their funding streams? And how are they then using that funding as well? And when they did some research around Esser spending, there were 4 big challenges that bubbled to the top. The first was that they noticed that even though there was this influx of a ton of cash and a lot of resources, student outcomes were actually still pretty low, or they were worsening beyond pre-pandemic levels. Some of that is because early Esser funding spend was spent on PPE, right? Personal protective equipment. It wasn't necessarily spent on academics, and it was earmarked for that. So not all of the Esser funding dollars was spent on student achievement, but the Esser 2 and Esser 3 funds were. And even with that, student outcomes are still declining or stagnating. The second thing that they found in their research is that there was a lot of poor Esser funding management or even pacing in how those funds were being used. And again, some of this was really gap management. So pre-pandemic, districts were facing budget cuts. They had an influx of resources coming in. And so rather than sort of balance the budget to deal with those cuts, they used the Esser funds to carry them over and bridge that gap. Now that those funds are no longer in place, they're going to continue to have the gaps that they had pre-pandemic as well. Or they were able to use the funds to create new positions that they already needed, but they didn't have the funding for it. And now that they are not going to have those funds anymore, how do they continue to keep those positions? So that was sort of the second finding. The third was really that, districts have needs. A lot of districts have a strategic plan, but the way that they're spending is not necessarily aligned to the vision, the strategic goals, or the pillars that they have in those strategic plans. And then the last one is probably what everybody is feeling in education. It's just the mental capacity it takes to try and figure this out makes districts feel really overextended, right? There's so many daily decisions they have to make on their plate. And this is one additional decision that is really overburdening and overextending the leaders. And so would love to ask you to add to the chat, are any of these speaking to you? Is there something that you've heard, something that you would feel comfortable as sharing that is happening in your district? Which of these challenge feel really relevant to what is happening in your district or school? All right. So thank you, Kate and Christy and Anna. I love what Kate said. They all really resonate, and that's true. And we hear that. We work with districts that are, very large, urban, suburban, rural, very small. It doesn't matter. These are the challenges that are consistently happening across the board. So what I want to share with you before we get into a framework is I want to share maybe 3 questions to just sort of have in your back pocket. And I think it will start to clarify, where you want to spend your energy in making decisions. And these are really, really easy questions. They just sort of fall into this bucket of, what are we doing? What will we do in the future when these dollars run out? And how do we sort of measure our impact? And so these questions are, and again, these slides will be shared with you, very specifically just sort of auditing your current state, right? What are we currently doing with ESSER funding? How much of it is going here? How much of it is going there? Who's being impacted by it, right? In general, like where are these dollars going? And I think once you sort of get that out on paper or you're able to verbalize it, it gives everybody some common starting points to have discussions and make decisions around. And it also takes away some of that overwhelm. A lot of times if things are just sort of in our head and not physically present somewhere or written down somewhere for us to discuss, it can feel more overwhelming. So this first question is really important. Would recommend that you don't skip over this, like just really audit the current state. What are we spending our ESSER dollars on? The second question is, what's our plan for when these funding dollars run out? Especially if we're one of those districts that use this to create really necessary support positions or extra teaching positions. We don't want to get to a place where we're actually getting rid of those positions again, right? And so what is our current plan for when these funding dollars run out? So you sort of start with the audit. This is our current state. And then you also start with a discussion around like, what is our plan for when it runs out? You can also be pretty aspirational here. You can say, I'd like our plan to be, or I hope our future state is. But in general, you definitely want to have this discussion around what will you do once these dollars run out this year. And then the third question is really around impact. So something that we saw in our research around, ESSER funding and ESSER spend is that districts were spending money on really easy to implement items. And I think it was Cindy who said it in the chat, that hurry up and spend sort of mantra that we were given as education leaders. And so, if this is something really easy for us to spend on and we can implement it right away, why wouldn't I spend my ESSER funds on that thing? But it's also really important to see, even if the decision itself felt very rushed, we can still determine what was the impact of that investment, even if the impact was really minimal, right? But if you see an impact on something like that, then you might want to decide that you prioritize continuing to invest in that. Or if you don't see an impact, then it makes your decision really easy. Maybe you pivot and think about if there is a different way to prioritize how you use your remaining dollars. So these are the 3 questions that definitely would start any conversations around. All right, we can come back to these questions. Feel free to add questions in the chat if they're coming up for you. But I do want to give you a chance to hear, so sort of 4 case studies around what districts we've worked with have done. And we tried to be really diligent about picking different size districts, different geographic regions to give you some diversity in how different districts are approaching this, no matter their individual context or the communities that they serve. So this is a district that I had the opportunity to work with in New Jersey. They are relatively small, less than 1,000 people. And their challenge that they sort of had top of mind when they got their Esser funds was, we want to improve student learning experiences. Pre-pandemic learning levels were great for this particular district. They had dipped during the pandemic, and they wanted to sort of use their funding to bring them back and hopefully also exceed pre-pandemic levels as well. So a little bit of background about them, besides the fact that they were small. They actually had a capital improvement project that was passed, and they are working on to build sort of a state-of-the-art middle school, which was going to be really powerful for this district. They also knew that the teachers were going to be moving physically into those classrooms. And so they didn't want to bring standard teaching practices in really innovative spaces. They wanted their teachers to be well equipped to fully maximize these incredible state-of-the-art classrooms they were going to have. And so this was the context that this particular leadership team was faced with. And if we're going back to the Stanford example around the group that was really creative with how they maximized their return on their investment, this was sort of their creative solution. So they decided that, they could use the money to beef up their state-of-the-art equipment. They could use the money to do training on the technology itself. But what they really wanted to invest in was teachers having innovative teaching practices. So they invested in professional development that deepened their teachers' knowledge on personalized and really student-centered teaching practices. And they also invested in doing some student focus groups to learn about the current student experience, so that they could sort of make an argument for why they wanted to sort of redesign the student experience. And so rather than invest in a particular program, they really invested in the people who were going to be in those spaces. So that's one way that you could have thought about just creatively using Esser funds. Here's a totally different challenge. So this was a district in upstate New York, also a very small district, around 3,000 students. And they recently had a superintendent, longtime superintendent, beloved, but was retiring. And so they had a superintendent from outside of the district transition in to assume that superintendency. And that superintendent actually spent some time just doing like listening and learning tours and learning as much as that person could about the district. And what that person noticed was there was a gap in the student support services that were happening post-COVID. And the superintendent said, like, my goal for the first 100 days is really just laser focused on addressing this gap, right? I'm not going to be making other changes. I'm not going to be adopting any new products or curriculum. I really am committed to thinking specifically about how do we support our students outside of the classroom and not just academically. And so their challenge was really, how do we address social emotional learning needs, or SEL needs? All right. So I'm going to go ahead and give you this one, but just a heads up, for the next few case studies, I'm going to see what sort of creative examples you all have now that you will have heard from two creative solutions. So for this particular superintendent, what they decided to do was, again, sort of invest in an SEL survey that was aligned to the CASTLE framework, which is really popular and well adopted throughout the state of New York, and use the findings from that survey and the focus groups to give the district really helpful data. That way they weren't making rash decisions or decisions that weren't aligned to their overall goals as a district. They were really just focusing and targeting support on SEL based on exactly what their students and the group most impacted was saying. So this is another way that you could think about it. It's not necessary to adopt a new program. It is necessary to hear directly from your students and design your solutions with them in mind. All right. So we talked a little bit around improving student learning academically. We talked a little bit about improving student social emotional learning supports. I'm going to give you a third case study, and this time would love to sort of get the wisdom of the room and hear if you all have some creative solutions on how to maximize these returns. All right, so this is an example district that is here in my current home state. I'm from Louisiana, so I don't necessarily claim Pennsylvania, but I am a resident of here. But it's an independent district, meaning it doesn't actually get, it's not public school, but it is an independent, sort of charter school. So this independent district, here was their context. they had a strategic plan that not only recently expired, it had expired pre-pandemic in 2019. And so they had just been operating sort of without this overall vision for the district. Um, this group felt that the mission, vision, the beliefs, even though the strategic plan itself had expired, those were still very much relevant and had carried them through making some decisions during the pandemic. However, the plan itself, so aside from this North Star that we like to call mission, vision, beliefs, or values, the actual plan, the focus areas that they had, did not feel actionable. It felt very much like these are lofty goals and we have no roadmap to get there. So their challenge was they really wanted to create alignment across staff, students in the community, because every decision that they were making was just sort of touch point to touch point, and there was no sort of long-term vision or umbrella that all of these sat under. So if the challenge is we want to create alignment, you have all this ESSER funding to spend, you have a strategic plan that's expired, what are some maybe ideas that you have for this particular leadership team? All right, so let's go ahead and see if you have any ideas. You can throw them into the chat right now. All right. You guys you're pretty close actually. So couple of things that we're seeing is like, one, we need people, and two, we need a plan, right? That's coming up in your actions. The strategic plan expired. It never felt actionable to even begin with. And we also want to make sure we have sort of a cross-functional team or a representative team to help sort of create that plan through community engagement. And that's really close to what this district ended up doing. So they decided to sort of undergo a new strategic planning process. They didn't need to redo their mission, vision, beliefs, but they needed new pillars, they needed new focus areas, and they needed to sort of build out a roadmap of how they would accomplish those focus areas. And so that's what they used their ESSER funds on. They set a target date that we want this to carry us through the next 5 years. They elevated voices of every constituent group in their district. And then they sort of split their costs, and they said half of our spend on this is going to be on building the actual plan. And then the other half, because we don't want this plan to just sit on a shelf, is we want to monitor the actual implementation of the plan. So how do we sort of look or work in sprints and say, this is our goal for the next 5 years, but in the next 6 months, this is what we're focused on. We're going to pause. We're going to see how we're doing. We're going to set goals for the next 6 months, and they monitored their plan that way. Amazing. All right. Well, thank you, Melissa, Emily, Mackenzie, and everybody else who was able to share your answers. I have one more for you before I'm going to share a framework and an activity that's going to help you sort of apply some of this to your own context as well. So here's a final challenge. This is a district in Ohio. And I'm so sorry. I know we have some international participants in West Coast. I realize I said this was going to be diverse geographically, and it's really Northeast. So I hope you're still able to get something out of this. But this is a district that is in Ohio, and they invested in data systems. And this is something we hear a lot from districts across the country. We have so much data. We have all these learning management platforms, all these student management systems. We are data rich, but we're information poor. We like to call that DRIP, right? DRIP. And what they wanted is they didn't want to say that those investments weren't impactful, because it gave them information they didn't have before, but they never invested in what to do with that information. And so they wanted to build really a strong data culture so that they could take that and really apply that information. And their challenge was, we don't want to adopt new initiatives. We just want to make progress on existing ones that have sort of stalled out. And so again, I'm going to ask you to think about, how would you spend your ESSER funding if this was your context and this was your challenge? So let's take about 1 more minute here and share some thoughts that you have. So let me share what this district did. They actually decided, very similar to what I believe Melissa said, they actually decided that our problem is not the information we have, it's the culture surrounding that information. Who owns it? What are our beliefs about data? You know, are they meant to be punitive, or are they meant to be helpful in us planning next steps? And so they invested their funds to implement what we call a responsive data culture. And all that means is they had training on effective data use. They had a platform for managing the data, and they wanted to make sure people knew exactly how to use that. They even created a data culture playbook. And all that meant is, this is sort of our cadence for when we look at data. These are our data cycles. These are protocols that we use for looking at data. This is how we analyze and act on data. These are our beliefs around data and why it's so important. And we believe everybody has ownership to help us realize those beliefs. And that playbook was really helpful for them because as they were navigating staff changes, it sort of became this onboarding tool that they would be able to use so that their Esser investment lived on even past sort of the time that it was used. All right. So we spent a lot of time sort of talking about why, we want to be thinking about Esser funding through the lens of those three questions, right? What are we using it on? What are we going to do when these funds run out? And how are we going to measure impact? And I was able to give you some case studies for how districts are thinking about those questions and what they did with their specific challenges. What I want to do next is give you a framework for thinking about your individual context. So you won't need it yet, but in about 10 minutes, if you have something to write with and something to write on, I'm going to have you do a mini exercise or reflection for your own context. Piece of paper will do, Post-it will also do, whatever you have available. So let's talk about how you can apply this and plan for your own future. In your follow-up resources that we'll send out after this webinar, you're going to get a framework that we developed this year. It's pretty hot off the press, and it's just called, the Art of Implementing Well. And the reason why we developed this is because I showed you in an earlier slide that we work with districts on instructional trainings, we work with districts on strategy, on surveys, on leadership. And what we have seen consistently across the board is that every district has initiatives, and every district has initiatives that plateau or don't have the impact that they want them to have. And we realize that there's a lot of barriers to implementing those initiatives well. And there's a common thread. It doesn't matter if you're talking about strategic planning, or if you're talking about adopting the science of reading, or if you're talking about a new data management system, there is a common thread on how initiatives sort of take hold and scale within a district. And that common thread are sort of these pieces and components that you see on the screen. So the way you would look at this is that strong implementation falls into really two categories. Strategy, right? What do we have in general as sort of our big picture or our goal for this particular initiative? And systems, what supports, what capacity, what resources do we have in place to make that initiative a reality? And there's no, correct way to read this. There are some components that naturally need to precede others. For example, in strategy, you wouldn't go directly to the implementation roadmap if you don't already have a vision in place. You wouldn't start allocating resources if you don't already have a team to make those decisions. But this is a good sort of gut check. You could take, an initiative that you're currently spending Esser funding dollars on, or a system that you're currently spending Esser funding dollars on, and you can just sort of go through this framework. There are some questions that you'll see on the back of the framework, and I'll show you a couple of them on my screen. And you can just give yourself a gut check. Am I doing this? Do we have this in place? And if we don't have this in place, then we might have an implementation barrier around strategy. Or if I don't have, these incentives or materials in place, we might have an implementation barrier around systems. Now, because we only have, just around 20 minutes left, I won't be able to go through every one of these components, but I am going to highlight two of these components that we hear over and over again that would likely apply to an existing initiative that you have. And that is vision alignment under strategy and materials and assessment under systems. And so what I'll do is I'll share a couple of questions with you, and then I'll give you an activity that will help you sort of think through these as well. So when you're talking about vision alignment, there's a few different questions that you might want to ask yourself that are slightly deeper than the what are we doing with this money? What are we going to do when it ends? Under vision alignment, the one that I want to highlight for you is this question around how this priority adds or enhances your overall vision. And so if you have a vision that you will have student-centered classrooms, and every student, regardless of what school they go to within the district, is going to have that same meaningful, relevant experience, then every initiative that you have should be in service of that vision, right? It should add to or enhance that overall vision. So that's one question you can ask yourself when it comes to vision alignment. There's others that you'll see in the framework as well, but this is the one that I want to highlight for you today. Under strategy, or sorry, rather under systems, when we're talking about materials and assessment, you could think about what do we already have in place, or what do we need to have in place to provide support for this particular implementation. So we could have the vision for it, but if we don't have the supports, the capacity, the resources, the people to make that vision a reality, then we're going to be either spending a lot of dollars on this with very little impact, or we're going to sort of overburden our team and make people feel over capacity as well. So if you know anything about education elements, we love a 2x2. We use it for almost everything. So this is where I would recommend you sort of get a piece of paper. I'll give you some independent think time, and then would love for you to share some thoughts in the chat. But want you to think about framing decisions that you're making on spending Esser dollars with this 2x2 in mind. And like I said, that implementing well framework has lots and lots of components. This just has 2 of them. So my recommendation is you just start with 1 or 2. If you start with them all, you will feel very overwhelmed. So think about the highest impact one, highest leverage one that you want to start with. For us, it's typically starting with vision. So if you think about this in a 2x2, you could have an initiative. You could actually sort of rank it in terms of how aligned it is to your vision. The more aligned it is, the higher up it should be on this 2x2. And the less aligned it is, the lower it should be on this 2x2. And then you also want to think about the systems in place or the materials that you have available. So if you don't have materials available, this will be further to the left of this framework. And if you do have the materials available, and that includes people, that includes time, it'll be further to the right. And so what I want you to do on your paper is just very quickly draw yourself a little 2x2. I want you to think about an initiative that you have spent your Esser dollars on right now. Maybe it is one-on-one tutoring and after-school tutoring program. We hear that one a lot. Maybe it's creating a brand new strategic plan. Maybe it is having personalized learning training so that you have really student-centered classrooms and your teachers are equipped to do that. Whatever the initiative is, go ahead and just plot it on this matrix. Is it aligned to your vision for the district? And if you can't answer that question, that gives you some information already. Maybe that's where you start. We want to create a vision for why we're using this. And then is it something that you have materials available for: time, people, resources, etc. Okay, so I'll play some music. If you get through thinking about the first initiative and you still have some time, think about another one. And what you might start to see is you sort of have this sweet spot of these initiatives are having a lot of impact because they are really aligned to the work that you're already trying to do. All right. So hopefully that was just enough time to consider at least one of your initiatives. For our final checkout today, I'm going to go ahead and give us a little bit of extra time here because I would love to hear some new learnings that you have. But just to recap what we went through, we talked about really thinking creatively about using your Esser allocations, using that Stanford business case study as a mental model to think about that. We talked about 3 questions that you can consider. What are we using our money now? What are we going to do when it ends? And what's the impact of our investment so far? And then I shared this Art of Implementing Well framework with you and a 2x2 that you can always use. You can change what these different axes say if there are different buckets from the Art of Implementing Well framework that you want to look at. If you want to go crazy and sort of, tie it to every single component, you can do that as well. But for our final reflection today, I really want to hear what was one new learning that you're leaving this webinar with. And then I have one more thing that I want to share with you before we close out. So what's one new learning that you had either from that exercise or from something else that we talked about today? Feel free to add it to the chat, and then I'll share one more thing before we go. All right. So a couple of the final reflections that came out in the chat is this idea of just out of the box thinking. So being that Stanford business group, you're thinking more creatively about how to use Esser dollars instead of just investing in sort of an easy to implement activity. Thinking about what you're already implementing through this idea of the Art of Implementing Well. The strategy and systems layers seem to spoke to a few of you. And I love Patrice's, answer, because I'm also a big fan of the 2x2. I think you can do a 2x2 with anything. I use it to make decisions for my household as well. I love your suggestion, Tim, about the three questions, right? Like, is there a better way that we can order it, right? Like, how are we using our funds right now? What's the impact of that? And what's our plan when they expire? I think that's a really good push. And that's a great idea. Awesome. All right. So before we leave, want to plug one more thing. We have prepared sort of this sort of spring series of different topics that we think might resonate mostly with you. So if you found this helpful and you were able to get something out of it, our next one is really around responsive leadership. So I showed you those 4 buckets that we support districts with. Today was really around strategy. The next bucket we're going to focus on is leadership. That's happening tomorrow. So if you haven't signed up, would highly recommend that you sign up for that. Even if you can't attend, you can get the recording and the slides and resources after. And you can see we have some other ones that are tied to this idea of initiatives or tied to the idea of engaging with your community or change that you're weathering through. So I really appreciate you joining. I hope you're able to join us for another webinar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.